Alright guys, how's it going? Today I'm going to have a closer look at asynchronous shaders. This is something that I have touched upon in one or two previous videos without going into it in much depth. In this video I'm going to be having a much closer look so that we can see exactly what asynchronous shaders are all about. We will see how it works in theory and in practice by looking at benchmarks. So let's start by having a look at a GPU block diagram. So this here is the layout of AMD's Fiji GPU. This one in particular is for the R9 Fury X. Along the left hand side, the highlighted part in yellow is all the memory stuff, which on the GPU itself means the memory controllers and the L2 cache. The memory controllers are what connects the card to the HBM, and the information that is most used remains in the L2 cache for faster access. Down the right hand side is all the multimedia accelerators. Most of this stuff is fixed function, it only does one task. You've got your video compression, your video decoding, and your true audio DSPs, that sort of thing. Now right at the very top are the interesting parts that we're going to be discussing here, the ACEs and the graphics command processor. It is these ACEs that allow for asynchronous shading. All of this work takes place in these CUs, which comprise of the bulk of the GPU. The Fury X has 64 of these compute units, and as you can see here, they are laid out 4x16. Now don't panic, but inside each of these CUs are 64 ALUs, or 64 cores, a little bit like the cores in a normal CPU. However, the cores inside a GPU are designed for graphical tasks. So what that means is overall there are 4,096 cores inside a Fury X. And this is where almost all of the real heavy lifting work is done on a graphics card. All of your lighting, all of your shading, all of your physics and your compute tasks, all of that stuff is done here in the meat of the GPU. The final highlighted parts here are the RBs, the render backends or ROPs. Basically speaking, this is what deals with the final part of the image before outputting to the display. Stuff like your anti-aliasing, that kind of thing. Now some of you may be thinking, why don't CPUs and GPUs have the same kind of architecture? The average CPU has between 2 and 8 cores, whereas GPUs are now up in the thousands. And the main reason for this is that GPU tasks are what is known as embarrassingly parallel. In other words, they are solving many similar but independent tasks. If you think about it, at a fundamental level, what a graphics card needs to do is display an image. This image is little more than a bunch of pixels, laid out one after the other. So what a graphics card needs to do is manipulate data, called vertices, in order to create an image many times per second on the screen. So the more resources you have to do this task, the faster it gets done. And it should scale in a near linear fashion, so long as there isn't a bottleneck elsewhere in the GPU. 4096 cores should theoretically be twice as fast as 2048 cores. That's the theory, but in practice it does start to break down just a little, because as the core count continues to rise, the inefficiencies start to worsen, and more gaps in the workload appear. And the knock-on effect is that more shaders are becoming less utilised, effectively just sitting around there doing nothing, because another inefficiency somewhere is preventing them from being used with 100% uptime. And all those are starting to add up, and this is where asynchronous compute engines and asynchronous shading comes into play. Now if you've been following my channel, then you've probably seen this slide before. Asynchronous shading cannot be done in DX11 and OpenGL, and here we can see that in those APIs, all commands that are sent to the GPU are executed in a serial fashion. So you start at the left by creating shadows, then you upload the data from the processor, then you compress the textures, and so on. And all of this stuff uses different GPU resources, so why can't they be run at the same time? Well, under DX12 and Vulkan, and in any of the new low-level APIs, they can. Shadows can be created, data can be uploaded from the processor, and textures can be compressed all at the same time. The end result is render time is saved, which means latency goes down and FPS goes up. It's just a win-win everywhere. And here we can see when both are together that is clearly the case. Now if you remember, going back to the ACEs and the graphics command processor, this is the part of the GPU where the information from the game code initially comes in. Now that information can be a simple command such as draw a graphic on the screen, like here, and that would go to the graphics command processor. A subsequent instruction might be shade the graphics on the screen, and that would go to a queue in the asynchronous compute engines. And as you know by now, both of these commands can be run asynchronously and in parallel. And this should allow the gaps to be refilled. In previous cases where inefficiencies were preventing compute work from being done, asynchronous compute now allows those gaps to be filled with compute work. It all sounds great in theory, But does it work? As of now, there are only 2 games that make use of asynchronous shaders, the main one being the very first proper DX12 game, Ashes of the Singularity. Now here we can see the R9 Fury X up against the GTX 980 Ti at 1080p with the asynchronous shaders disabled. Fury X appears to have a lead of around 8% here, which is unusual. Yeah, normally you would expect this to be the opposite way around. So already we have to say the game looks a little bit favourable to AMD cards. However, at the same resolution and same settings, after async compute is enabled, the AMD cards gain another 10%. But what's really interesting is that the GTX 980 Ti loses performance in every single case this happens, and we can see that more clearly here in this AnandTech benchmark. Fury X actually gains 20% performance at 4K resolution when async shaders are turned on. Effectively, what that means is that 20% of those compute units, or looking at it in core count, over 800 of those 4096 cores that are in Fury X are not being used until asynchronous shading is turned on. 20% of the GPU, that is an awful lot, and it goes a long way to explaining some of the inefficiencies that we are starting to see in the newer graphics cards. But what is going on with Nvidia here? Well, this is where things start to get complicated. Here is the Titan X block diagram. If you understood what was happening with the Fury X block diagram, then most of this should be pretty obvious. You've got the memory controllers on either side, and you've got the larger level 2 cache in the middle. And each of those little green squares are Nvidia's version of cores, known as CUDA cores. In the case of Titan X, there are 3072 of these, so quite a bit less than what is in Fury X. Titan X doesn't use HBM memory, but otherwise it's mostly the same. Until you look at the top, where you can see the GigaThread engine. So Nvidia doesn't actually have any of those asynchronous compute engines. They have their own version of it. So let's take a look at what this means. Soon after the Ashes of the Singularity benchmark numbers were known, AMD's Robert Hallock, who is their technical marketing guy, made this comment on Reddit, saying that Nvidia claims full support for DX12, but conveniently ignores that Maxwell is utterly incapable of performing asynchronous compute without heavy reliance on slow context switching. Now, the job for marketing guys is to make their own company look good and other companies look bad. However, this does seem to line up with what we were seeing in Ashes of the Singularity. Here we can see 2 workloads, the graphics workload in green and the compute workload in red, with the shader resource utilization number on the vertical axis. This green part is where graphics work is being done on the GPU, and then an instruction is made for compute shader work, at which point the graphics work tails off in order for the compute work to come in. Once the compute work is finished, the graphics work continues. And this is effectively what happens on an Nvidia Maxwell GPU. If we now have a look at what happens with true asynchronous shaders, we can see that the graphics and the compute work is running together, asynchronously. There is no need for the context switch, which causes the graphic work to stop while the compute work is finished. And you can also see clearly that overall the shader resource utilization is almost topped out. And what this effectively means is that the work finishes earlier, here, compared to here, meaning the frame rate is higher and the latency is lower. It's just a better way of doing it. This is how it works on GCN graphics cards, and this is how it works on Nvidia graphics cards. And this is why AMD cards gain with asynchronous shaders and Nvidia cards don't. In Nvidia's case, they are better off not trying to run asynchronously, a point that was made clear once again when the latest game to feature asynchronous shaders, Hitman, also showed a regression in performance going from DX11 to DX12 on Nvidia cards. It's worth noting here though that AMD cards didn't gain anything like as much as what they did under Ashes of the Singularity. And this is worth thinking about. At the Game Developers Conference in the middle of March, the Hitman developers did a presentation including discussion on async compute. And you can see here that on AMD cards they have got a win of 5 to 10%. And there is no difference on Nvidia. But what is really interesting here is what they say about it being hard to tune. Too much async work can make it a penalty, and the PC has lots of configurations. Now, Oxide with Ashes have been working on this for a very long time. We don't know exactly how long they've spent on async compute, but in the very early Ashes of the Singularity beta benchmarks, the Fury X showed nowhere near the kind of gains that we can see now. So this really does appear to be something that is hard to tune, and maybe something that takes many months of figuring out. And then it may well be on a card per card basis. Now over at Nvidia, they've been full on damage limitation about this for the past 7 months now, promising a driver that never seems to come. To me, this is something that isn't actually fixable in a driver, but maybe it's not quite as bad as it looks. Damien over at Hardware France organised a meeting with Rev Lebaradian, the Senior Director of GameWorks for NVIDIA. Now this guy's an engineer, he's not a marketer, and normally when you want to get the real story, you would go to an engineer instead of a marketer. When pressed about NVIDIA's poor asynchronous shader performance, the initial responses were the same kind of canned responses from the marketing guys. Eventually, however, Damien did manage to finesse a different answer for once, and it's one that's actually very interesting. The first point that was raised was, if async compute is a way to increase performance, what matters in the end is the overall performance. And this is true. The Fury X may gain 10% from async compute, but if the 980 Ti is 20% faster, it really doesn't make much difference. And quite often we do see that the 980 Ti is a good deal faster than the Fury X. Now this is a translation from French, but what he's saying here is, if GeForce is more efficient, then using multi-engine or using asynchronous shaders is not a top priority for NVIDIA. And most interestingly, what he said is that there are fewer holes in the activity of its GPU than its competitor. In other words, where a card like the Fury X can be as bad as 20% underutilized like what we saw in Ashes, what he is saying here is that Maxwell is nowhere near as inefficient. He's basically saying that Maxwell is already tapped out, or very close to full utilization. So asynchronous shading is not going to do much more for the Maxwell architecture anyway. Now Damien finishes off by agreeing that NVIDIA's arguments are good, and I would also have to agree with that. It's very difficult to get the real story here, but it's not difficult to imagine that Maxwell is a far more efficient architecture than what GCN is. The story is probably somewhere in the middle. Obviously NVIDIA would like to get the benefit of asynchronous shading, but their architecture is just poorly suited for it. However, it doesn't make that much of a difference in the end, because in the majority of cases they are still the faster GPU. Another interesting thing to think about here is that AMD are likely to fix their inefficiencies in cards like the Fury X when Polaris comes around. New command processor, new 4th generation graphics core NICs CUs. It is pretty likely that much of Polaris' advancements will come from a better front end and better utilization of the graphics cores. And if that is the case, then you're going to be looking at diminishing returns from asynchronous shaders. There is sort of a feeling here that this whole asynchronous shaders thing, it's almost like AMD has created a problem for themselves and then fixed it. But it would be better had they not created the problem for themselves in the first place. It's really difficult to know just how badly this is affecting NVIDIA though, and how much of this is an actual issue with graphics cards or how much of it is an issue with AMD graphics cards. That one remains to be seen. It's worth noting, however, that the GTX 780 Ti had 2880 CUDA cores, whereas the GTX 980 only had 2048. When NVIDIA developed the Maxwell architecture, they cut back on the core count and increased the clock speeds, whereas AMD continued to add more and more cores, all the way up to 4096 with the Fury X. This does, however, mean that if NVIDIA plans to double up their CUDA cores with Pascal, then they may run into these kinds of issues. However, I have it on good authority from 2 different sources that Pascal will indeed do proper asynchronous shading. Apparently it will be on a level of the early GCN graphics cards, however it will be able to do compute and graphics at the same time, which appears to be the important thing here. They really ought to have it. It will be almost 5 years since AMD first added the ACEs to their GCN architecture, so NVIDIA has had plenty of time to realise what way this was going. In the end, asynchronous shaders are here to stay. This is the way forward for graphics. It's very useful for virtual reality as well, as it enables a feature called asynchronous time warp, but that's something I'm not going to go into in this video. This whole thing's been an interesting story to watch develop over the past year. It's been interesting to watch AMD actually make use of a marketing advantage, while NVIDIA seemed to constantly put their foot in their mouth, when really all they had to say at first was, Maxwell is already very good at shader utilization and doesn't need asynchronous compute to perform well. Why didn't they say that from the start? It's like their default position is to spin something, rather than admit that they may not have a feature. One of the issues here is, of course, NVIDIA has been selling Maxwell cards as DirectX 12_1 compatible, whereas AMD cards are only 12_0. To the uninitiated, this means that NVIDIA cards must be better at DX12. when it's clearly not the case. So that's definitely one to think about as well there, because quite often marketing wins out against the technology, and I am quite sure that a lot of people bought Maxwell graphics cards expecting them to be better at DirectX 12. Now in the end, like I said, it doesn't really matter in terms of performance, but it's still something well worth thinking about. Async is here to stay, but you're not going to get it on a Maxwell GPU. It's not something that's easy to do, that's for sure, and I'll be very surprised if the gains hit 10% in the average case. Right, before I wrap this one up, for my subscribers I have an Ashes of the Singularity Steam key to give away. All you have to do to be in with a chance of winning is leave a comment below. Anything whatsoever. Tell me what you think of the video. This one's been a little bit more technical than the average one, so I'm interested in knowing what you think about that. Otherwise, anything at all will do, and I will pick a winner at random and contact you through YouTube tomorrow. With a bit of luck, we'll have some more information on Nvidia's Pascal in the next week, and I have a rather epic video in the works as well. As usual, there'll be a bunch of links in the description below, and I will catch you later, guys.